The dust of the Wild West carried stories in every gust of wind, secrets in every grain that danced across the endless plains, but none more fateful than the one that began with a cowboy, his loyal dog, and the silence of a scorching afternoon, where life and death wrestled in the heat of the sun, and fate revealed itself in ways no man could predict. For the cowboy named Jace Morgan was a man of the land, born of hardship, raised by storms, and molded by the solitude of open ranges, a man who thought he understood the rhythm of life until the day his dog, Boone, raced ahead barking at something half buried in the dust, a shape that at first seemed nothing more than another fallen traveler in a land that often showed no mercy. But as Jace drew closer, he realized it was a woman, her body frail and broken by the unforgiving trail, her lips cracked from thirst, her breathing shallow as though each second she teetered on the edge of death itself. And Boone circled her with the anxious devotion only a faithful animal could show, whining and pawing at Jace as though urging him to hurry, to do something before it was too late. And Jace, hardened as he was by years of ranching, gun smoke, and loneliness, felt something stir in his chest, something he could not explain, for in her fragile form lay not just a stranger but a destiny he had not known was written for him. Though he did not yet understand that the woman in the dust was more than a life he was about to save, she was the bride, promised to him by fate, though neither of them had ever met, and their meeting would ignite a story of love, danger, and redemption that the West itself would never forget. And so, kneeling beside her, Jace removed his hat, shading her face from the blazing sun, whispering gently as though afraid his voice might break her final fragile breath. "Hold on, ma'am, you ain't dying today. Not if I've got any say in it." His voice a mixture of grit and tenderness, and as he lifted her into his arms, her head fell against his chest, and in that moment he felt the weight of her suffering, but also something more, something spiritual, as though God himself had placed her in his path, and he vowed silently that he would carry her not just to safety but into a future she deserved. And Boone trotted alongside them, his eyes glancing up at Jace with the kind of knowing loyalty only a dog could have, as though he too understood that this was no ordinary rescue, but the beginning of a bond written in heaven and tested by the harsh reality of the frontier. And as Jace laid her across his horse and rode hard toward his ranch, the dust rising behind them like a storm of destiny, he thought back on the dreams he had carried since boyhood, dreams of a woman he never met, a woman whose face had been only shadows in his mind yet always close to his heart. And he wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, the woman cradled in his arms was the living, breathing answer to prayers he had never dared to voice aloud. And so the journey began, a chapter of love and danger carved into the very soil of the West, a story that would test the limits of courage, honor, and devotion. But before any of that, before the gunfights and the betrayals, before the trials and the triumphs, there was only this one man, one dog, one dying woman in the dust, and a promise unspoken yet undeniable, that their fates were now forever bound. And as the ranch rose in the distance, like a fortress of survival, against the empty horizon, Jace knew his life would never be the same, and neither would hers. For this was the day a cowboy found not just a stranger but the woman who was to become his promised bride, though the road to that truth would be long, perilous, and filled with revelations that neither could yet imagine. And as Boone barked into the wind, the sun dipped lower, casting the land in gold, and the story that would capture hearts across the West had only just begun. The woman awoke to the scent of leather, wood smoke, and the faint sound of Boone's gentle whine, as if the dog had stood vigil all night. And when her eyes fluttered open, she found herself in a small cabin room, sunlight leaking through the cracks of old shutters, her body wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and the earth itself. And though her lips were dry and her throat burned like fire, there was water waiting on the bedside table, placed carefully by a hand that had clearly known patience and care. And when she tried to rise, the pain in her body pulled her back, reminding her of how close she had come to death. And it was then she saw him, Jace Morgan, leaning in the doorway, arms folded, hat tilted low, his rugged face softened by the flicker of worry in his eyes, a man who looked every bit the cowboy that legends spoke of, yet carried something in his stance that legends rarely mentioned, a loneliness that had been carved into him by years of silence, and when she met his gaze, he gave her a small nod, as though to say without words that she was safe now, safe in his care, though the world outside remained merciless. And she whispered, her voice hoarse and fragile, "Why? Why did you save me?" And Jace, after a long pause, answered with a tone that blended grit and vulnerability, "'Cause Boone found you, ma'am, and because no soul deserves to be left to die in the dust. Not out here, not while I've still got breath in my lungs." But even as he spoke, there was something unspoken in his eyes, something she felt but could not yet name. And when she asked his name, he gave it simply, as though it carried no weight, "Jace Morgan." And when he asked hers, she hesitated before answering, "Evelyn." And the name hung in the air like a bell tolling softly across the plains, a name he felt he had heard somewhere before, though he could not place where. And Boone wagged his tail as though he already knew the truth that would soon unravel, that this woman and this cowboy were not strangers by accident, but tied together by a promise forged long before they had laid eyes on each other. And as days turned into weeks, Evelyn grew stronger under Jace's watchful care. The fire in her spirit slowly rekindled, though the shadows of whatever had driven her to near death still haunted her eyes. And Jace never pressed her, knowing that the West had a way of breaking people in ways that couldn't be spoken aloud. But fate has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. And one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and the sound of coyotes echoed in the distance, Evelyn sat by the fire and finally spoke the truth, her voice trembling as she confessed, "I wasn't just running from the desert, Jace. I was running from men who claimed I was promised to them as payment for a debt, men who swore they owned me like cattle, and I thought I'd rather die in the dust than be chained to a life not of my choosing." And Jace's jaw tightened, the flames reflecting in his eyes, because now he understood why fate had placed her in his path, for her words stirred something deep in him, a memory of an old letter tucked away, written by his mother on her deathbed, a letter he had only half believed when he first read it, telling him that one day he would find the woman God had promised him, a woman who would appear when he least expected it, a woman who would test his courage and restore his heart. And now, staring at Evelyn, he realized the letter had not been a mother's hopeful rambling, but prophecy. And though he wanted to tell her then and there, he knew words would not be enough. Actions would have to prove it, because the men she spoke of were not shadows of the past but dangers of the present. And sure enough, Boone's growl one night broke the fragile peace, for out beyond the fences of the ranch, torches flickered in the dark and riders approached, men with greed in their eyes and violence in their hearts. And Evelyn's face paled because she recognized them, the ones she had escaped, the ones who would rather see her dragged back half dead than let her live free. And Jace, standing tall, hand resting on the butt of his revolver, whispered only 3 words to her, words steady as iron and gentle as prayer, "You're safe here." And in that moment Evelyn realized he wasn't just a cowboy, he was a shield, a man who had lived his life alone but was now willing to risk everything to protect what had been entrusted to him. And as the riders closed in, the night split open with the echo of Boone's bark and the ring of steel drawn from leather. And Jace stood on his porch like a lone sentinel against the storm, ready to defend not just his ranch, not just his honor, but the woman fate had promised him. The woman he now understood was his bride, not by law, not by arrangement, but by the unshakable design of destiny itself. And though the battle that followed would scar the land and test their souls, it was here, in this chapter, that their bond was sealed not by words but by fire. And as the dust of struggle settled and the night gave way to dawn, Evelyn looked at Jace with tears in her eyes, whispering the truth her heart now knew. "I was promised, Jace, but not to them, to you." And he, weary but unbroken, touched the brim of his hat, a smile ghosting across his rugged face, for at last he understood what his life of solitude had been preparing him for. And Boone wagged his tail, the faithful guardian who had first uncovered the secret in the dust. And so the story continued, a story of 2 souls bound by providence, who would face trials yet unspoken, enemies yet unseen, but whose love, born in the dust of death and the fire of danger, would rise unshakable as the mountains themselves. And to hear what comes next, to ride with them deeper into the heart of the West where love and fate collide, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because the journey has only just begun. and you won't want to miss the chapters still to come. Dawn broke with a stillness that felt unnatural, the kind of silence that made even the birds pause, as if the land itself knew storms were gathering. And though the night had passed with Jace standing guard and Evelyn sleeping fitfully under the watchful eye of Boone, peace was no more than a fleeting illusion, for the men who had come for her were not finished. They had only retreated to gather strength, and Jace knew enough about desperate men to understand that they would return with numbers greater and vengeance sharper. Yet when he looked at Evelyn, still fragile but burning with the will to survive, he felt his resolve tighten like the grip on his revolver, because she was no longer just a stranger he had saved. She was his responsibility, his promise, his bride in the making, though neither of them had spoken those words aloud. And when Evelyn awoke to find him already saddling his horse, she asked softly, fear trembling beneath her voice, "You're leaving?" And Jace shook his head, his eyes steady as steel. "Not leaving, preparing, 'cause they'll be back, and when they come, they won't be looking to negotiate, they'll be looking to destroy." And though fear washed over her, she found courage in his calm, for there was something unbreakable about the man, something that told her even if the world turned against them, he would not bend. And Boone barked once as if agreeing, his tail wagging though his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. And Jace spent the day strengthening the ranch, checking the rifles, laying traps along the ridges, every motion precise, practiced, as though he had been preparing for this fight his whole life. And perhaps he had, for the West demanded men who could stand alone against storms, and Jace Morgan was one such man. But even he had not expected fate to tie his fight to the heart of a woman he had barely come to know, yet already could not imagine losing. And as the sun fell once more, painting the sky in blood and gold, Evelyn approached him with something clutched in her hand, an old pendant worn smooth with time, and she pressed it into his palm, whispering, "This was my mother's. She told me once it belonged to a man who would come for me one day, a man who would protect me when all else was lost. And Jace, it matches your name." And when he opened his hand, he saw the engraving, faded but clear enough, Morgan, etched into the metal as though destiny itself had carved it. And his breath caught, because suddenly his mother's letter, Evelyn's escape, Boone's discovery, all of it wove together into a truth undeniable. This woman had not stumbled into his life by chance. She had been bound to him before either of them drew their first breath. And while the realization filled him with awe, it also filled him with fear, because promises that deep, that eternal, were the kind that men would kill to destroy. And even as the weight of revelation settled over them, the sound of hooves shattered the night once more, louder, heavier, the ground itself trembling under the approach of a dozen riders, and torches flared like demons in the dark. And Evelyn's breath caught as she recognized the man at their head, Silas Grady, the debt collector, ruthless and cold, the man who had sworn she would never escape him, a man who believed in ownership, not love, power, not grace. And Jace stepped forward to meet him, Boone at his side, his rifle steady, his voice carrying through the night like a blade. "You'll ride back the way you came, Grady, or you'll ride back in coffins." But Silas only laughed, a cruel sound that echoed across the valley. "You think you can stop me, cowboy? That woman belongs to me, promised in blood, paid for in debt." And Evelyn cried out, her voice cutting through the darkness, "I am not yours, Silas. I was never yours, and I never will be." And the fire in her eyes gave Jace strength, but it also sealed the fight, for Silas raised his hand, and his men surged forward like wolves, gunfire tearing through the night. And Jace met them with the fury of a man defending more than land, more than pride, but love itself, firing with deadly precision, each shot echoing with purpose, Boone darting in and out, fierce as any guardian angel. And Evelyn, no longer willing to hide, loaded rifles and handed them to Jace, her hands steady despite the fear, her courage born from the belief that destiny had not brought her this far to let her fall now. And the battle raged until the air was thick with smoke and the earth stained with the cost of defiance. But still Jace stood, bloodied but unbowed, his arm wrapped around Evelyn as Silas himself dismounted, drawing his pistol, eyes burning with hatred. And in the tense silence before the final shot, Jace spoke low, voice steady as the mountain wind. "You'll never own her, Grady, because she was never meant for you. She was promised to me." And with a flash of steel and thunder, The fight ended, Silas falling to the dust, his curse silenced forever. And though the night swallowed the echoes, the truth remained unshaken. Jace and Evelyn were bound, their promise sealed in fire and blood. And as dawn rose once more, painting the horizon in hope, Evelyn leaned against him, whispering words that made his heart ache with a joy he had never known. "You didn't just save my life, Jace, you saved my soul." And he held her close, Boone circling them as if to guard their vow. And in that moment the West itself seemed to breathe easier, as though destiny, at last, had been fulfilled, though trials still lay ahead. For promises such as theirs were always tested by time and by enemies unseen. But for now, under the rising sun, they stood as one, a cowboy, his dog, and the woman who had been his promised bride all along. And so the legend began to spread across the plains, whispered in saloons, carried on the wind, a story of love born in dust and fire. And to follow where this tale leads next, to witness the battles still to come and the love that only grows stronger, don't forget to subscribe, because this is only the beginning of a saga that will outlive the West itself. The West had a cruel way of giving peace only long enough for a man to believe it might last, before tearing it away with the sharp edge of reality. And though the dawn after Silas Grady's fall glowed golden across the ranch, and Evelyn rested against Jace as though she had finally found safe ground, the world beyond their fences was far from finished with them. For Grady had not been a lone wolf, but the head of a pack, and news of his death spread quicker than wildfire across the plains, whispered in saloons, muttered in back alleys, until men with greed in their hearts and vengeance on their minds swore that Jace Morgan had not just defied one tyrant but an entire network of lawless power. And while Jace worked the land as though nothing had changed, mending fences, tending cattle, watching Evelyn regain strength with every sunrise, Boone never stopped watching the horizon, his growls at unseen shapes in the distance a warning that shadows still lingered. And Evelyn herself, though her laughter returned in moments by the fire, carried in her eyes the weight of unfinished battles, for freedom once claimed must always be defended. And she knew deep down that Silas's men would not forget, nor forgive. And so when a rider came thundering into the valley one afternoon, bloodied and gasping, collapsing at Jace's gate with a bullet lodged in his side, the fragile peace shattered, for in his dying breath he whispered a name that sent ice through Evelyn's veins: Harlan Grady, Silas's brother, a man far crueler, far more dangerous, who commanded not a handful of mercenaries, but an army of outlaws, stretching from Texas to Colorado, a man who considered blood debts sacred and vengeance holy. And if Silas had been a storm, Harlan was a wildfire, merciless, consuming everything in his path. And when Jace heard the name, his eyes hardened, for he understood that destiny was not yet finished with him. And Evelyn gripped his hand, fear rippling through her but trust, anchoring her heart, whispering, "We can run, Jace, we can disappear." But Jace shook his head, his voice low and steady. "No, darlin', running only makes the wolves hungrier. This land, this life, this love, it's ours, and I'll fight every devil the West can throw at me before I let it be taken." And Boone barked once, as if sealing the vow. And so the days ahead were filled with preparation, rifles cleaned, horses trained for speed, alliances quietly sought from neighbors who respected Jace's name. Yet even as he braced for war, something unexpected bloomed in the quiet hours. The bond between him and Evelyn grew deeper, her laughter softening the hard edges of his solitude, her presence in the cabin turning it from shelter into home. And one night, under a sky thick with stars, she told him the truth her heart had long carried. "When I was lying in the dust, I thought I had no future, that my story ended there. But then Boone found me, and you lifted me up, and I swear, Jace, I knew right then my life was tied to yours, that God himself had written me into your story." And though Jace had never been a man of many words, he took her hands in his, calloused fingers trembling with the weight of his own unspoken feelings. And he whispered, "You ain't just in my story, Evelyn, you are my story." And with those words, their love was no longer silent, it was alive, burning as fiercely as the fire in the hearth, a promise deeper than any vow. And yet even love could not hold back the storm that gathered, for scouts reported that Harlan's riders were on the move, dozens of them, armed to the teeth, sweeping across the plains like locusts, burning homesteads, leaving messages carved into wood and blood. Jace Morgan, we're coming. And when the smoke of neighbors' cabins rose on the horizon, Jace knew the fight was no longer about survival alone, it was about justice, about standing against the tide of lawlessness that sought to devour not just his bride but the land itself. And so, on the eve of battle, with the air heavy and the night alive with the distant drum of hooves, Jace and Evelyn stood together on the porch, Boone at their side, and Evelyn, though fear trembled in her voice, spoke with courage that could shame any man. Whatever comes, Jace, we face it together. And Jace, eyes on the horizon, his hand resting gently on hers, replied, together, darlin', till the dust takes us both. And as the first torches appeared in the darkness, flickering like the eyes of demons, the cowboy, his dog, and his promised bride prepared to face a fire greater than any they had yet known. And though the night would test them beyond the breaking point, it would also prove the truth the West itself had carved into their souls, that love, once promised, could not be broken. Not by dust, not by death, not by the devil himself. And so the chapter closed not with peace, but with the thunder of war drawing near, and the promise of a love ready to defy it all. And if you want to ride with them into that storm, to see whether love can truly outlast the fury of an outlaw army, make sure you subscribe, because the greatest battle of their story is about to begin, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The night cracked open with thunder that wasn't born of the sky but of hooves and gun barrels, for Harlan Grady and his army of outlaws descended like a storm across the valley, torches flaring, shouts carrying on the wind. And Jace Morgan knew the hour had come when all his preparation, all his courage, and all the love he held in his heart for Evelyn would be tested in the fire. And Boone's growl was low and steady, hackles raised as he stood at Jace's side like a soldier ready for war. And Evelyn, though her hands trembled, held her rifle with the resolve of someone who had chosen not to run, not to surrender, but to fight for the life and love she had finally found. And as the first wave of riders crested the ridge, the valley lit up in chaos, bullets cutting through the night, sparks flying off stone, shouts mingling with cries of pain. And Jace's rifle sang its deadly song, each shot precise, each bullet a message that he would not bow, not break, not surrender. And Boone darted into the fray, fast as lightning, dragging men from their saddles, his teeth flashing, his courage unyielding. And Evelyn, firing from the porch, struck down a rider who had tried to break through the fence, her heart pounding but her spirit aflame. For in the heat of the battle, she discovered a strength she never knew she carried. And as the outlaws pressed harder, Harlan himself rode forward, a dark figure atop a black stallion, his eyes like burning coals, his voice booming across the chaos. Morgan, you killed my brother, and I'll see you buried beside him before this night is done. And Jace, reloading with the calm of a man who had faced death too many times to fear it now, shouted back, your brother claimed what was never his, Harlan, and you'll find the same fate waiting for you. And with that, the duel was sealed, not with pistols at dawn, but with the fury of an entire battlefield roaring around them. And wave after wave crashed against Jace's defenses, men falling to traps he had laid, others scattering at the bite of Boone's fury. But still they came, and the night stretched on like a fever dream of fire and blood. And in the thick of it all, Evelyn stood her ground, reloading rifles, covering Jace's flank, her courage feeding his, her very presence reminding him of why he fought, why he would not fall. And though the outlaws outnumbered him, something greater than numbers fought on his side, love, destiny, and a will forged in the silence of lonely years now awakened in full. And when the battle thinned to a brutal standstill, Harlan dismounted, stepping into the open, his pistol gleaming in the torchlight, his sneer carved with hatred, and he called out, face me, Morgan, man to man, let's finish this without your dog. Beside his brother's memory, and the outlaws, seeing their leader slain, broke apart like a wave against rock, fleeing into the night, scattering to the winds, leaving behind silence so heavy it pressed against the chest. And Evelyn ran to Jace, tears streaming, clutching him as though to make certain he still breathed. And Boone barked wildly, circling them, tail wagging in triumph. And Jace, though a bullet had grazed his shoulder, stood tall, pulling Evelyn close, whispering words only she could hear. It's over, darlin', we made it. We held on, and she, burying her face against him, whispered back, "No, Jace, we didn't just hold on, we began." And as the dawn rose slow and golden, washing away the shadows of blood and fire, the ranch stood battered but unbroken, and the legend of that night began to spread. How one cowboy, his dog, and a woman once left for dead, had stood against an army and carved their love into the history of the West. And though challenges still lay ahead, though the land was still wild and the future uncertain, one truth was now unshakable. Evelyn was not just the woman Jace had saved. She was his promised bride, his destiny fulfilled, his partner in a story far from finished. And as Boone lay at their feet, watching the horizon with calm eyes, the world itself seemed to exhale, as though acknowledging that something greater had been written in the dust, a love fierce enough to defy death, strong enough to tame even the Wild West. And if you want to see where this love will lead next, to witness the chapters still unwritten in a saga of courage, faith, and passion, don't forget to subscribe, because their journey has only just begun, and the best is still ahead.